All right, folks, thanks for joining us back after lunch on time. We have thus far covered the data that we need to bring into HEC-FDA to reflect the engineering aspects or the engineering components of assessing flood risk, right? And so that has meant the distribution of flows, right? So that's the flow exceedance probability function. What is the elevation of the river for the range of flows? And then we looked at levee performance. There's a great question that we had right at the end of our last hour, and I want to talk about that question for just a moment. So there's a question about assessing risk for high hazard dams versus low hazard dams. And so if we're talking about high hazard dams versus low hazard dams being, if the difference there is economic development that has occurred downstream of the dam since construction, HEC-FDA can readily capture that in the assessment of risk, right? So we can use HEC-FDA to differentiate the risk where you have higher economic development downstream of a dam. If we're talking about the integrity of the dam, in other words, the probability of breach, HEC-FDA does not currently have the functionality to reflect the risk as a function of dam breach. The only option right now would be to use a regulated unregulated function so that you can show what the outflows, the distribution of outflows could be for a given inflow. And it sounds like the breach event is usually overtopping of the dam. Then you have 100% probability of breach and release of the entire flood and sediment pool. So the assumption there might be that you have your regulated, unregulated function up to the top of the dam, showing either decreased flows or the same amount of flows. But then if the flow rate is such that the pool reaches the top of the dam and overtops, then you could show the increase in outflows for that level of inflow. And so there you could capture the probability of dam breach or the consequences of dam breach. But it is that is a trickier part of the engineering that goes into HEC-FDA. And so what I did was to write that down on our list of things to do as we develop the new version of HEC-FDA. We have a long list of things that we want to do so that we can make this a really good product. And looking at reflecting risk as a function of dam breach, as well as reflecting risk as a function of levee breach, those are things that we want to refine. All right, so the last piece we need to put together is the economic data so that we can get a representation of vulnerability, a representation of exposure, and a representation of consequences. This all comes from economics and is summarized in the stage damage function. So recall that the stage damage relationship describes the level or the distribution of damage measured in dollars at a given elevation or stage of flooding. And this is primarily an economics input relationship. Once we have this, the combination of hydrology, hydraulics, and economics results in the damage exceedance relationship, which we integrate to get expected annual damage, our measurement of risk. Okay, so let's talk about how we put together a stage damage relationship. the stage damage relationship comes from linking water to structure and content value to damage. So the first the distribution of the first four elevations for a given structure, and the first four elevations, that's the vulnerability, right? So that determines a distribution of depth of water above the first floor for a given water surface elevation. This distribution of depth of water above the first floor translates into a distribution of percent of structure value and content value damaged, which are linked to the respective structure and content value distributions, which produce a distribution of structure damage and a distribution of content damage. Summing the two distributions, we get the stage damage relationship, as shown in the image at the bottom of this slide. So this is the stage damage relationship overlaid with the distribution of damages for the stage represented by that horizontal line, right? So you see the stage damage curve, that's the thin curved black line, and then you see a distribution. And imagine that distribution as hopping out of the slide, right? So that's sort of, we're using a Z coordinate there to show the distribution of damage for the stage at the horizontal line. Okay, so this is the link between water to structure and content value to structure and content damage to damage for that elevation of water. So let's talk about the sources of uncertainty in linking water to structure and content value to structure and content damage. So we are uncertain about the number of structures by category and construction type, um, which matters, right? So construction type is a component of, if you have, we're thinking about construction types that are more resistant to flood damage versus others that are not. We are uncertain about structure values by building type and use. We use depreciated structure replacement value. So we look at damage as, we calculate damage based on the value of the structure as is. Content value by building type and use is typically expressed as uncertainty about a content to structure value ratio. So we often use the content to structure value ratio to estimate the value of the contents within a structure. And that means that the value of the contents in a structure are solely determined by the value of the structure in which they reside. But we do know the value of contents could vary based on income, region, household members, so on and so forth. So the uncertainty about the content to structure value ratio is meant to capture these items that we haven't included in assessing the contents of a structure. The first floor elevation of a structure, uncertainty here comes from precision and accuracy of measurement. Often we get at the first floor elevation of a structure by adding foundation height onto ground elevation, and foundation height is often measured by counting steps, right? We just look at Google Earth, we count the number of steps, so counting steps, there's less uncertainty in the number of steps, but there's uncertainty in how high those steps are. There are regulations or codes over how high those steps should be, but there's still uncertainty in that. And then finally, uncertainty in damage as a percent of value for structure and content for a range of flood depths. So we need a depth percent damage function so that we can calculate the percent of damage of a structure value for a given depth of water above the first floor elevation. This is, if we go back to the links between water and structure, we calculate a structure depth damage function by multiplying the percent of structure value damaged for a given depth. And that gives us a distribution of structure damage. Right, so we have percent damage, depth above first floor elevation. This curve is basically multiplied by the structure value, which gets you uh, a function that represents not relative damage, but gross damage for the different depths above the first floor elevation. There are a lot of things that go into how much of a structure's value is damaged for given depths. Things like the velocity and or duration of flooding, right? So if the velocity is really high, then there's a chance that the structure just collapses and 100% of the structure value is damaged. Duration of flooding matters because if the flooding recedes very slowly, then there's a much greater chance of, rather there's going to be a higher level of damage. The construction period or the reconstruction period matters too. The longer it takes to get people into a home that was flooded, the more likely you're going to have mold, and mold can really affect the level of damage of a home for a given depth above first floor elevation. So then the bounds around percent damage for a given depth, that's meant to reflect all these items. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and this is kind of a cursory approach, but this is the using depth percent damage functions is the standard in the work that we do right now. There are a lot of there's active research in doing a better job at modeling damage, but we have not there hasn't been, I don't think, any actionable results from that research yet. But research is actively underway. So let's talk about how we can get the data we need into HEC-FDA to compute stage damage functions. So the first thing that we need to do is identify structure occupancy types. So for different groups of structures, such as residential one-story no basement or residential one-story with basement, we're going to have a depth percent damage function, right, which is this relationship you see on the right-hand side screen. We need to get that relationship with uncertainty into HEC-FDA so that we know what is the percent damage for a given depth of flooding above the first floor, and what is the uncertainty in that damage. So we have depth percent damage functions for structure and for content. We want to know the uncertainty in the first floor stage, right? So first floor stage, that's foundation height plus ground elevation. And we enter our uncertainty about first floor stage as the standard deviation in feet, if we're going to think about the distribution around first floor stage being normal. You can use none if you do not wish to reflect uncertainty or error in first floor stage. We will reflect the uncertainty in the content to structure value ratio that we just talked about. So here, our content to structure value ratio is 100%. So here we're saying that the value of the contents in a structure are equal to the value of the structure itself. And our uncertainty parameter here is 10%. 10%, so this is standard deviation in percent increment. What this means is that the uncertainty in the content to structure value ratio is entered as a coefficient of variation. It's a coefficient of variation, so that that would be multiplied by the content to structure value ratio to get the actual standard deviation, which in this case would be 10% times 100, which would be 10%. The uncertainty in the structure value is also entered as a coefficient of variation. Here we're using a normal distribution. The coefficient of variation is 5.22%. This is really helpful. So the using a coefficient of variation for the content to structure value ratio doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. And in 2.0, we won't be doing it that way. But for the structure of values, this is really useful because the best estimate, which we're going to assume is the mean of a structure's value, is going to be the value in the structure inventory, right? But then we want a distribution about that value. And so if we use a coefficient of variation, we can reflect the same relative uncertainty for all structures in this occupancy type, but scale the uncertainty by that structure value, right? So if our structure had a value of $100, then the standard deviation would be 5.22% times 100, so that the standard deviation would be $5.22. Okay. So this basically covers the occupancy types. There are three groups of I think I would say that there are three pieces: occupancy type, structure, inventory. There are two big pieces of data entry for economics. The first is this occupancy type. The occupancy type that has the depth percent damage function, content to structure value ratio, and uncertainty parameters. The other big piece of data that goes in for the economic relationship is the structure inventory. And so at the moment, where this is not a georeferenced software, 2.0 will be, but 1.4.3 is not georeferenced. So we enter a structure by its ID, and that's the individual structure on the screen. Under that is the stream station. And the stream station is how we tell FDA where the structure is located. We need to enter a structure value. We can enter a content value, but we won't because we're using a content to structure value ratio. We need to specify the damage category. In this case, it's residential. The occupancy type, 1-story, no basement. We need to specify the stream. And then a module is a way to include different structure inventories. In this case, we're just using the base module, so we're only using one structure inventory here. But if you want to include different structure inventories, for example, to reflect non-structural actions, if you're elevating structures or floodproofing structures, then you can include that as a separate structure inventory, which would be represented by a different module. In 2.0, the idea of modules won't exist. We'll just have separate structure inventories. Okay, the last piece that's really important here is to identify the structure stages. So we either need a first floor stage, first floor elevation, or we need a ground elevation and foundation height. So the top image that that reflects the approach of entering the first floor stage. And you can see that that line on the structure is where the bottom of the first floor, right? We can enter a beginning damage depth if we think that damage will occur before water reaches the first floor stage. If you have a basement, for example. So then the opening of the basement windows would reflect the beginning damage depth. And note that beginning damage depth, that is a depth, right? It's not a stage. So if let's say the stage of the basement window were 481.3, then we would enter the beginning damage depth as 2 feet, because 2 feet below the first floor stage. Now for ground stage foundation height, we can get at the first floor stage by entering the ground stage and the foundation height, which are summed to equal the first floor stage. And so you can see that the ground stage here is 480.3, foundation height is 2, and that equals the first floor stage of 482.3. All right, so we have two big pieces of data, right? We have all the structures and their characteristics. We have the occupancy types. Occupancy types help us to calculate percent of the structure value that's damaged for a given depth for all the range of depths, which get us the level structure damage for all the depths. And once we've done that, we aggregate over that level of damage for all the depths over all the structures in a given impact area. And we do that with uncertainty. So we're sampling the structure value, we're sampling the first floor elevation, we're sampling the content to structure value ratio so that we can get a distribution of stages, I'm sorry, a distribution of damages for a given stage. Okay, so let's talk about this. Here is a report of a stage damage function. Stage is the first column, then we have damage, and then we have the standard deviation of error. So we have a distribution of damage for a given stage, right? The uncertainty, this uncertainty is described using confidence bands around the mean or expected level of damage. And the dispersion of the confidence bands are a function of the uncertainty about the factors that together define the stage damage relationship. Those are those things like uncertainty in percent damage for a given depth, uncertainty in the first floor stage, uncertainty in the structure value. All those things feed into the standard deviation of error here. So what this relationship effectively represents is the relationship between the economic cost resulting from flood damage and the elevation of the flood inundation or stage for a given plan, year, stream, and reach, as well as damage category, right? So we have aggregated over all the structures for a given plan. The plan will reflect the without project condition or a with project condition. Stream and reach are locations within the study area that have specific river stations. And so we connect the river stations of the structures in each damage reach, which is synonymous with impact area, for a given analysis year. So we are going to calculate expected annual damage for two analysis years, the base year and the most likely future year. And finally, we aggregate stage damage over damage categories. So we're going to have a stage damage function for residential. We'll have a stage damage function for commercial, for industrial, for public, so on and so forth. Let's look at a plot of the stage damage function. So you can see here the median damage as represented by the red line with triangles. And then we have plus or minus 1 and 2 standard deviations. Here, so we're using a normal distribution, right? So the median is equal to the mean. And then we have, so plus and minus 1 standard deviation, plus and minus 2, plus and minus 2. That gives us about the approximate 95% confidence interval. And you can see that we are representing damage as a distribution for a given stage, which reflects the uncertainty about the stage damage function. So before we move on, we have talked about all the inputs that we need. I just want to quiz. Let's do a quick little quiz. Remind me some of the reasons that we might be uncertain about the level of damage for a given stage. Go ahead, drop some stuff in the chat. Because this is the uncertainty in the stage damage function. This is one of the most important computational functionalities of HEC-FDA, that is the compute in a stage damage function with uncertainty. I saw a hand raised. Please feel free to take yourself off mute. Or please feel free to drop your answers in the chat. Why do we have this distribution of damage for a given stage? Please go ahead and drop your answers in the chat. So we got the amount of contents in the basement, and that's exactly right. We're thinking about even the amount of contents in a structure. We are uncertain about the value of the contents in a structure. We are uncertain about the number of structures in the floodplain. We're uncertain about the first floor elevation. Now, why require or do a standard deviation when we don't require confidence interval in the project report? So that may be true for the NRCS. For the Army Corps of Engineers, we have to present our results with uncertainty. It's required of us. If it's not required of your reports, then it may not be worth trying to specify all this uncertainty if it's not part of your process. But we are uncertain in our estimates of damage and of risk, and so it really is helpful to be able to describe damage with a confidence interval. All right. Thank you again for indulging me. Now that we've talked about all the inputs, let's talk about how we incorporate our estimates of uncertainty of our inputs into our risk assessment. And so what you're going to see is what HEC-FDA does is curve sampling, right? So HEC-FDA is has a frequency-based approach, whereas when we're looking at HEC-FIA, that is a single event based, right? So you have one flood event and you look at damage from that one flood event. FDA, we calculate risk, not just damage, but risk for the entire range of probable flood events. And we do that through representing the hazard, the performance, the consequences as curves. We incorporate uncertainty as distribution about those curves, and we produce our results with uncertainty by sampling our input curve distributions. Okay, that's kind of a lot and might be a little opaque. So let's talk about this step by step, right? So now that we've looked at these sources of uncertainty, we're going to take a few minutes to walk through what FDA does with this uncertainty to get you the results that you need, and these are going to be results with uncertainty, right? So we've seen a similar set of diagrams before, only now we're going to discuss how FDA puts the methodology we've been discussing on assessing risk with uncertainty to use. So HEC-FDA is going to randomly draw from each of these functions distributions. So we'll randomly draw a flow frequency function, we'll randomly draw a stage flow function, we'll randomly draw a stage damage function, and composing these three functions together gives us a randomly produced damage frequency function. We integrate that guy. The area under that curve gives us one realization of expected annual damage. But this is not the final estimate of expected annual damage, right? We're trying to get the distribution of expected annual damage so that we can describe risk with uncertainty. So let's look at how we do that. Basically, we are going to repeat what you saw many, many, many times so that we'll get many realizations of the damage frequency curve. Okay, so we are sampling right now, and we're looking at a running average. If you look at the middle of the screen, we have a running average of expected annual damage. Let's look at that again. So we're sampling, and the running average is going up and down and up and down, and eventually the average of expected annual damage converges. We end up with a distribution of expected annual damage. So the distribution, let's look at the histogram on the bottom right-hand side. We see the relative frequency of expected annual damage in that probability distribution. The top is a cumulative distribution function. Okay, so that's how we incorporate all of that uncertainty to produce our estimate of risk with uncertainty. And once that is done, we can look at our results of expected annual damage in HEC-FDA. So we have specified all of our input relationships. We have clicked evaluate plans by analysis year. Now we can look at expected annual damage. And so this is one of the reports we'll get out of HEC-FDA. We have expected annual damage by plan and damage category. And this is specific to an analysis year. Because, yeah, so expected annual damage, HEC-FDA does not have any concept of time, except for interpolation of expected annual damage between the 2 years for which we compute expected annual damage. So these are like static estimates. The thing that we're really interested in, so here, you could show the benefits of Plan 1 as the difference between total expected annual damage, right? That would be risk reduced. One of the really interesting reports, I think, is the expected annual damage reduced and distributed report. This is for all plans by analysis year 2024, right? Expected annual damage is specific to, is sort of a static estimate. So we look at total without project damages, total with project damages, take the difference, and that gives us damage reduced. But we also get a damage reduced distribution. And so if we look at Plan 1, damage reduced was $12,000, $12,890. But that is the mean damage reduced. The 3 columns on the right give us that probability distribution of damage reduced. And so the core likes to say the probability of damage reduced exceeds indicated values, so that the probability that damage reduced exceeds $6,600 for Plan 1 is 75%. That is, for me, a terribly confusing way to reflect that $6,600 is the first quartile of damages for Plan 1, damages reduced. Okay, so you have the first quartile under the column labeled 0.75, the median 0.5, and then the third quartile is the last column. And you can see that the mean varies quite a bit from the median for several of these distributions. So here, if we look at Plan 1, mean damage reduced is $12,890, whereas median damage reduced is $10,300. So we have relatively skewed right distributions, which coincides with what we saw in this slide, right? We have a skewed right distribution of expected annual damage. Okay. So there's more. We have been saying that we calculate expected annual damage with uncertainty for a base year and for a most likely future year. The Corps of Engineers evaluates benefits, carries out risk assessment over a 50-year period of analysis. So we're going to want to discount future year benefits to the base year so that we can compare benefits to costs on an apples-to-apples basis. To do that, we're going to take into account the time value of money for benefits and costs. And we'll discount benefits to the base year. We are going to compound costs up to the base year because costs are the cost of construction, and we assume that benefits start once construction is complete. And so if we have costs, they're going to be compounded to the base year. All these benefits are going to be discounted to the base year. So then we're on an apples-to-apples basis, and we call that to be in average annual equivalent terms is the core term for this. So we're going to look at average annual equivalent damages. We have a 50-year period of analysis. We'll have a base year expected annual damage, a most likely future year expected annual damage. We're going to interpolate between the base year and the most likely future year to get expected annual damage during the intermediate years. And then we're going to hold expected annual damage constant from the most likely future year to the end of the period of analysis. All of these expected annual damage values are then discounted to the base year, Basically, we're going to amortize this thing so that we can get an average annual equivalent damage estimate. We'll enter the federal discount rate for investment projects, which is given by the Treasury. Here, the discount rate was 2.5%. I think it's 2.25% now. Our analysis period is 50 years, so we're looking at expected annual damage occurring each year over 50 years, discounting that damage back to the base year, so that we can compare equivalent annual damage reduced, so those are the equivalent annual benefits, to the equivalent annual costs. And just like with expected annual damage, we can represent the damage estimates as a distribution. So we have the first quartile, the median, and the third quartile in expected annual damage reduced. Okay, so that's a second measure of risk. Expected annual damage is the first measure. Average annual equivalent damage is the second measure, and that just takes into account time value of money. Okay, but wait, there's even more. So we have talked about assessing risk, and we have assessed risk for with project conditions and without project conditions based on a hydrologic relationship, a hydraulic relationship, and an economic relationship. So we have assessed risk, and we can compare the benefits to the costs. But there are other considerations, such as project performance. And project performance, basically, we're going to want to describe the probability of getting wet. And that's we're taking a function of the hazard and the system performance, so like the levee fragility, to estimate what is the probability of getting wet. So the first metric here is annual exceedance probability. And this is the probability that a specific capacity or target stage will be exceeded in a given year. For levees, AEP is the chance of failure or exceedance in any given year. AEP includes the full range of events, and for this reason, this is the metric used in NFIP quantitative risk assessments. In the without project conditions, AEP represents the annual chance of significant flooding. So we want to basically identify a target stage. The target stage could be the stage at which a levee is overtopped. It could be the stage at which significant damage occurs. And then we want to know what is the probability that that stage will be exceeded on any given year. And that is the annual exceedance probability. The annual exceedance probability is identified from the stage frequency curve. So we look at that stage of 44 feet. We find the probability of exceedance. That's the annual exceedance probability for that stage frequency realization. And through our curve sampling approach, when we incorporate uncertainty in our stage frequency curve, we get a distribution of annual exceedance probabilities. We often use the average annual exceedance probability as our representation of this distribution, and that would just be an average of the probabilities of exceedance of a stage of 44 feet. Okay. The next way that we can characterize this part of the risk equation, that is hazard and performance, is long-term exceedance. And this is the probability that one or more flood events will occur within a specified time period, or the likelihood that the target stage will be exceeded at least once over that time period. The calculations are made directly using the binomial distribution. So this is just 1 minus in the difference of the 1 minus the complement of AEP to the power of the number of years. And that gets us the chance of flooding one or more times in T years. We can look at an example. We'll often use the mean annual exceedance probability to calculate long-term risk or long-term exceedance probability. And if we plug 0.162 into the equation, and we're going to look at a 30-year period, if our mean is mean annual exceedance probability is 0.162, then the chance of flooding one or more times in 30 years is 0.995 or 99.5% chance that of a significant flooding will occur one or more times in a period of 30 years. Okay, we have one more metric of project performance, and that is assurance. And this is, we used to call this conditional non-exceedance probability, but now we're saying this is assurance, same thing. This is the chance that a specific target, so we're thinking about the top of the levee, will not be exceeded given the occurrence of a specific flood event. So we're thinking about with how much assurance can the project pass a 1% flood event, right? So the assurance of a given event is the probability that the given flood event will not overtop a levee or cause significant damage. Now, the realizations of the stage frequency curve are again plotted on the right. The conditional non-exceedance probability can be defined as the fraction of stage frequency realizations that are below the target stage for a given event. And that's represented by the red bars of the histogram that you see on the screen. So the red bars give us the relative frequency of stages below the target stage for the 1% event. Okay, so we are 90% sure that the 1% event will not overtop the levee. That's what we're saying here. Now I can make this just a little bit complicated and talk about another measure of assurance. So when we're on this slide, we're talking about assurance of a target stage. We can also talk about assurance of annual exceedance probability. In other words, what is the chance that the annual exceedance probability will be less than 1%? So the assurance of AEP, in other words, the fraction of AEPs that are less than an AEP of interest, is actually going to be equal to the assurance of a target stage as long as we're not using a levee fragility function. If we are, then these things are going to be different. So in the case that a levee fragility curve has been defined, then assurance of AEP is not going to be the same as assurance of the event. In this case, so the top image is AEP without a fragility curve. The bottom is AEP distribution with fragility curve. And we calculate AEP with fragility as the sum of the joint probabilities of hazard loading times levee breach. We look at this distribution of AEPs, and if we're interested in the assurance of AEP being less than 1%, we'll look at the relative frequency of AEPs that are less than 1%, which are represented by the solid blue bars on both of these things. And you see that when we take fragility of the levee or imperfection of the levee into consideration, then there is a 54% chance that the annual exceedance probability will be less than 1%. Whereas we had higher assurance when we didn't consider the imperfection of a levee. We were 87% sure that the AEP will be less than 1%. So all these performance statistics that we've talked about are available in a report that looks like this within the HEC-FDA user interface. We have the plan name, the stream name, the damage reach description, and then the target stage. So the target stage, that's the stage at which we measure assurance, right? That's the red line here. The target stage is 52. Over here, the target stage was 44, right? So we can get the average AEP for a target stage of 44. Then in the report, we have mean AEP that's expected. We have median AEP. We have long-term risk for 10 years, 30 years, and 50 years. And then here, the third block of project performance statistics is conditional non-exceedance probability by events. That's assurance by events. So if we look at the top row, so for damage reach SF8 in the without project condition, there is an 83.53% chance that significant damage will not occur with the 10% flood. Okay, that's it for project performance statistics, and that wraps up my presentation on assessing risk with HEC-FDA. With that, I think that we have a couple of options of how to spend the next 15 minutes. I see a hand raised. Harry, do you have a question or a comment? Okay, I'll continue. So we have two options. We can either look at the user interface together. I'm not sure how helpful that would be. I think it's typically more helpful to poke around in the user interface yourself to kind of learn where things are. We have a bunch of workshops that you can follow with screenshots and such that walk you through everything that we've looked at today. So my recommendation would be to, if you're interested in learning more about using FDA, to follow our workshops, and I will give you a link to, let's see, we want to link to the, I have a full flood damage assessment course with workshops online, including recorded lectures and such. And I'll put that link in the chat. And so my suggestion would be to look at some of the special topics that I have in the other presentation, unless we feel strongly that we should look at the user interface. Does anybody feel strongly that we should look at the user interface? I see no strong opinions there. So then we would like to look at the user interface. Okay. Oops. Send this to everybody. Okay, I am putting the link to that complete course in flood damage assessment with workshops in the chat. And we can take some time to look at the user interface. So we have about 10 minutes left of my presentation time. And then we'll get into question and answer. Bear with me while I open up a study. Well, I can share this screen and then you can see what's going on. Okay. Share screen. All right. So I have, I just want you to get out of the way. Whatever. So I've opened the software. We're looking at HEC-FDA version 1.4.3. I'm going to open an existing study, and we'll walk through where you will put in all of the data that we've covered. So bear with me while I just open. I have a study set aside that I know is solid. So this comes from one of the workshops. The study comes from one of the workshops at that page that the link that I put in the chat, you can download the study at that page. So the first thing to do, you'll want to enter some study info, name your study, give your study a good description. We have price information for the values of the structure inventories. So if your structure inventory was developed in 2014, but it's 2022, you may want to increase the value of the structures based on inflation. So if there was a 25% increase in the price level from 2014 to 2022, then we'd update the price index to be 1.25. Next, we configure the study. So we're going to enter the study streams. We enter the study damage reaches, and the study damage reaches are identified using a downstream river station, an upstream river station, and then an index location. The index location is going to be the location within a reach uh, at which the flow frequency function was estimated. The stage discharge should reflect that location. And then the stage damage structure, the stage damage functions for each structure, they're aggregated to that location. We will specify the analysis years and the plans as well. Analysis years, we have a base year and a most likely future year. Plans, those are going to be your without project condition, and then all of your with project conditions. Under hydrologic engineering, we need to enter the water surface profiles. So this gives us the water surface elevations at all of the structures. If there's a structure at a river station that is between two river stations in our water surface profiles, then HEC-FDA will just interpolate the water surface elevation at that structure. We need to enter the exceedance probability functions with uncertainty. That may be analytical or it may be graphical, right? Analytical is that log Pearson type 3. Graphical, we're drawing straight lines between the flow values. And we can either do discharge frequency, which is what you see here, or we can do stage frequency. There's nice functionality here. You can grab the stages or the flows from the water surface profiles to develop a graphical frequency function. We can do the same to develop a synthetic analytical frequency function based on the data from the water surface profiles. But that's not, we've heard from our engineers that doing so is not good practice, and so this functionality won't exist in 2.0. We need our stage discharge functions. So that's also under the hydrologic engineering. So we enter our discharges and our stages, which we can again get from the water surface profiles. If we want to use HEC-FDA to calculate the uncertainty about the stages, we can tell HEC-FDA to do that, or we can enter by ordinate and enter these standard deviations of errors ourselves. If we calculate, then we're going to set stage error, basically the maximum standard deviation of error that will occur in our stage discharge relationship, which in this case is 0.5. And the standard error will be constant at a stage of 474.53 and thereafter. Okay, that's our stage discharge. The last piece of the hydrologic engineering is levee features. We have a levee in damage reach SF9 for the different plans. So plan 2 and plan 3 in this case have a levee. We have entered the top of levee stage, but we haven't entered a geotechnical failure analysis or otherwise a fragility function here. So the assumption is that the levee is perfect until the levee is overtopped. We enter our occupancy types and damage categories under the economics menu. So we looked at this occupancy type user interface where we have the name, the description, the depth percent damage functions, the content to structure value ratio, and then our uncertainty parameters. Under the economics menu, we'll also enter our structure inventory data. So we have the structure ID, the station at which the structure is located, the structure value. We have the damage category, stream, occupancy type, and module, the structure stages as well. So we have entered the first floor stage here. Finally, once we have entered our hydrologic engineering data and our economic data, we can compute stage damage functions with uncertainty. Let's just look at this computing. It's pretty quick, and 2.0 will be even quicker. If you have a large number of structures, it'll be a little bit slower, but 2.0 will be faster than 1.4.3. We want to view stage damage functions with uncertainty. We can look at the plot, in this case, the stage damage function for Plan 2, Stream S Fork Bear analysis year 2022, damage reach SF9, and for the residential structures. So we have aggregated damage over residential structures within damage reach SF9 for analysis year 2022 and Plan 2. Here is that same diagram that we looked at where we have the median damage and plus or minus 1 and 2 standard deviations. We can check under evaluation study status reports to make sure that all of our exceedance probability functions for each of the plans are complete, represented by a P, that all of the stage discharge functions are complete, represented by an S, and that all of the stage damage functions are complete, represented by a $sign. If there were an asterisk, that would tell us that one of the functions is incomplete, and we need to complete that function before we can compute expected annual damage. If we see that all of our functions are complete, then we can go to evaluation of plans by analysis year, and we can compute expected annual damage. Right, so right now we're computing expected annual damage for 2022. We're running 78,000 simulations for reach SF8. We ran 25,000 relations for each SF9. The number of simulations depends on how long it takes to converge expected annual damage and converge the distribution of stages. Once we have computed expected annual damage, we can go to evaluation results and look at damage by analysis here. We looked at the damage reduced distribution report. We can look at that by plans for a given analysis year, and this is the same report that we looked at, expected annual damage reduced and distributed. Once we have computed expected annual damage, we can go to equivalent annual damage. We'll enter our analysis year, so over how many years are we calculating expected annual damage? What is the current discount rate? Click one or many plans. As long as we've computed expected annual damage, we can compute equivalent annual damage. We hit compute, bada bing, bada boom. Evaluation results, we can go to equivalent annual damage analysis. Let's look at the reduced in distribution for the plans. And here we have without project equivalent annual damage, with project equivalent annual damage, the difference between the two, which identifies the benefits, and the distribution of the difference between the two. Finally, when we have evaluated the plans by analysis here for expected annual damage, we also get project performance. Project performance, we're going to look at, we can do target stages by damage reach, or we can get performance by damage reach, performance by, or plan and damage reach. That'll be for one analysis here because this comes out of the expected annual damage compute, so it's specific to a particular analysis here. And then we get that same report that we just looked at. We have annual exceedance probability, long-term exceedance probability, and conditional non-exceedance probability. And that, my friends, is HEC-FDA in a nutshell. With that, we have another quick break scheduled. So we have I think a 10, 15-minute break scheduled. I know that I just threw a ton of information at you. I'm exhausted. I need a 15-minute break, so let's do that. And let's come back at 23 plus 15 gives us 38. Let's come back at 3:38 Eastern Daylight Time, and we will have our Q&A session. All right, folks. Thank you. Go enjoy your break. I'll leave the WebEx up.